Okay, well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this meeting tonight. This is our first of 5 meetings to discuss the post-implementation review of the Brisbane Airport flight paths. My name's Donna Marshall. I'm the Head of Community Engagement at Airservices, and I guess, for the want of a better term, I'll be your captain for this evening. So my job tonight is to give you as much information as possible about the post-implementation review and to answer questions. So our agenda, I've got all sorts of things to hold here. The agenda for this evening, I'll go through in just one moment. Before I do, I would actually just like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight. That would be the Turrbal and Yuggera people. And I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and welcome any traditional owners who may be with us here this evening. Our agenda, after I whip around and just explain who we've got here for you this evening, we're going to firstly just go through the post-implementation review, what it is, how it will work. We'll also talk about what the approach to community engagement will be, and we'll be looking at some of the feedback we've already received on our draft terms of reference and some of the updates that we've made as a result. We'll then go on to flight path design, and it's quite a complex topic. The purpose of this evening is to just give you a bit of a basic overview of what we see when we look up at the sky, and to share some of that with you. There'll be multiple opportunities as we move through the PIR to look at that in more detail, so please don't sort of feel you have to get it all in one night. Again, questions available though tonight on that. Then we'll be looking at operations and how we actually operate the airport and the flight paths, and then moving on to a noise presentation, so how we go about looking at the actual noise versus the modelled noise. Just a bit of housekeeping before we do get underway. We did think you had to wear your mask at all time. You don't have to, as long as you remain seated. Bathrooms are up the back, and if there is an emergency, please just follow the direction of the staff. We will be trying to keep our presentations as brief as possible. We're trying to allocate equal amount of time to presentations as we do to questions. We've got a roving microphone, which Prema will be bringing around the room. If you have a question, that's mainly so that our recording picks it up, and also our people who are watching the live stream at home can hear what your question is. With the questions that we get tonight, we will be putting all of the responses up on our Engage Airservices page. So don't feel like you have to scribble madly tonight. Everything that you see in here tonight will be up on our Engage page. So that includes the questions to any answers, it includes the presentation you'll see, and it also includes the video of the event. And just a note on that, so the session is being videoed. The camera is trained on me, not you, so none of you are actually in shot. So if you're watching the presentation, you will only just see the Airservices people. So just quickly whipping around the room, introducing the people that are here tonight. Firstly, we've got Justin, who is a flight path designer. And then we've got Kate, who is one of our operations people. Prema, who is from the community engagement team. And Beth up the back, who's also community engagement. And Glenn right down the back, he's our safety man. And Bridget, who's over here on the laptop, she's from community engagement, and she'll be moderating the questions that we get through the live stream this evening, so that we can answer some of the questions from the people who have joined us online. Okay, I think I've covered all of that. Oh, and sorry, there is a couple of other quick acknowledgements. So we do have attendance here tonight from Brisbane Airport Corporation. So we have Jess and Michael down the back. They're obviously a stakeholder in this, so they've come along to hear what's said tonight. And there may be representatives of the recently announced Government Advisory Forum that are attending through the live stream. They are very interested, obviously, in observing our meetings, but didn't want to attend in person because they didn't want to take places away from the community members. And I think, yep, that's all I've got to go through for now. So I'm going to do this. All right, so the PIR purpose. Okay, I like to move. Okay. All right, I'll stand here. So the purpose of our PIR, so Airservices conducts PIRs as a matter of practice 12 months after a flight path change. The reason for the 12 months is that we like to gather a whole year's worth of data because there can be seasonal influences on airport operations with winds and so forth. So we always do them 12 months after runway or flight path change. The purpose of them is to really look at, there's a few things. The first one for us is to look at what's the actual noise level compared to what we thought it would be. And I know everyone in this room is very interested in that. What we do with that is, firstly, we take learnings. How can we improve our modelling and so forth for future projects? But importantly, we also look at where there is a difference in the modelled versus the actual. You want me to use this one? You want me to stand here now? Do I have to? And I can still use this microphone? Okay. All right, so I've got to listen to the sound guy, he knows what he's doing. Yeah, so I'm just going to move this easel out of the way because people over on this side can't actually see me if I'm standing at the lectern. Okay, that's better. All right, we'll get organised. Yeah, so what we do then too is if we do find that there's a difference between what we modelled and the actual noise levels, we find the reason for that and we share it with the community. So if it's something to do with different aircraft types or heights or whatever it is, we share that with you. And then we also see if there's a way that we can address any differences, obviously when there's a higher noise level than what we anticipated. We also use the PIR to get community feedback on our operations, particularly where the lived experience is different to what was expected, and we try to identify opportunities to fix that if we can, or to improve it where it's safe and feasible. We consider industry feedback as well. The airlines often give us input as part of these post-implementation reviews because they've spent the last 12 months flying those flight paths and they may have some suggestions as well. We provide opportunity for the community to submit suggestions on noise impacts, and I have sort of seen, a bit of commentary around this and, Airservices, you're supposed to be the experts, why you're relying on the community to find a way to fix noise. That's not what it's about at all. In fact, I think if we did it the other way and said, look, don't you worry, we'll fix it, that would probably, not go down too well. The reason we do that is that you may have a suggestion that you think will work and we'll consider it genuinely. And I'll go through the process shortly about how we're going to facilitate that process. We like to confirm the usefulness or otherwise of our noise tools. So we have aircraft in your neighbourhood that provides information on actual flight movements. We have WebTrack where you can look at the noise monitoring. And we also have our noise and flight path monitoring system, NFM, I don't even know the acronym for that. We have that system on our website as well where people can get information. So we like to get feedback on whether or not that's useful and, of course, to engage meaningfully with the community. For this PIR, we are suggesting, or we are doing 2 phases. The first phase will focus on COVID operations. What have we seen since COVID or since runway opening, because COVID hit before the runway open? How is that different to what we expected, and is it purely attributed to COVID operations? Because COVID has had a major impact on the aviation industry, particularly around things like origin and destinations for ports, and that then has a flow-on effect for fleet mix, which can mean that the flight paths operate very differently to how we initially anticipated. So we look into that and we want to share that information with you. If we think it's a lasting impact that's not as expected, again, we look at it to see if there's something we can do to improve outcomes where safe and feasible. Phase 2, we'll look at post-COVID impacts. Now, we don't exactly know when post-COVID will be. During phase 1, what we will be doing is looking at what we believe the industry will look like after COVID and how Brisbane Airport will operate after COVID. We'll share that information with you, and then that would likely be the trigger for when we would do phase 2, when we hit whatever that post-COVID operating condition will be. Or we may say, look, if we don't hit it by a certain time, we'll start because we don't want to keep this open forever. And the reason we're doing the post-COVID review is that once aircraft operations return to post-COVID levels, you may see something different to what you're experiencing now, and again, it may be different to what you expected. So it gives you another opportunity to tell us if there's a problem, and another opportunity for us to look at those operations. This is just a bit of a brief slide on roles and responsibilities in aviation. It is incredibly complicated. I only started in aviation a year and a half ago, and I had no idea who did what. But just briefly, Airservices. So we're an air navigation service provider. And what that means is we're responsible for the flight paths, for designing them and ensuring the safe operation of those flight paths, and for the aviation fire rescue service, or the firefighting on the airport. They're our two core functions. We're not a regulator. We don't have a power to issue fines or infringements or anything in terms of the use of the flight paths. We are purely a service provider who is, we have to maintain the safety of Australia's air navigation. We actually look after 11% of the world's airspace, and we've got one of the safest airspaces in the world. The Civil Aviation Safety Authority, or CASA, they are the regulator. They look at safety though, they're primarily around safety. If we make a flight path change, we have to apply to CASA for approval of that change. So that's their remit. They're purely around safety, but they are the regulator. If there is a problem, they have the regulatory power. And then the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications. They're the agency or the government body that oversees aviation in Australia. They are the body that has the power to look at curfews, movement caps, all of those sorts of things. So those curfews and movement caps don't sit within Airservices' remit. We'll be putting more information out about this as part of the information pack that we send out once we've got the terms of reference finalised, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a snapshot. Prema, there is just one question there if you want to just take the mic.
Testing. We're just going to hold on to the mic.
If Prema could just hold it, COVID,
yeah,
all that.
Sure. Thank you, Donna. Can you quickly explain who regulates noise?
So there is no, I guess, regulation per se on noise. There is no maximum allowable noise level in aviation operations. So there isn't a limit that's been established by government that says you must maintain aircraft movements under this decibel rating on the ground. In terms of addressing the impacts of aviation noise, that primarily sits with Airservices because we are the ones that design the flight paths. We also operate the noise complaints and information service. So we can't say, oh, we've hit a certain level, we'll now stop operations, but we are the ones who will have a look and see if we can improve the noise outcome for the community. So moving on. So the PIR process, I'll just whip through this really quickly. We engage on the terms of reference, which you've already been part of. After this series of 5 meetings that we're holding, we'll be putting the updated draft terms of reference back out for a second round of review. We have made a few changes to it based on feedback to date, and we want to give you the opportunity to have a look at those. We provide information on operations, noise, and other things that are of interest, so that you've got some background information to help you participate more fully in the PIR. We review complaint data. So obviously there have been a number of complaints about the Brisbane flight paths. We'll be looking at that to identify themes, locations, and that kind of thing, and we'll be sharing that with you as part of the PIR. There's obviously the community feedback opportunity, and that's going to be through a number of forums that will be probably more interactive than this, but we try to do it face-to-face. COVID's affected that a bit over the last 12 months. We have had to use WebEx meetings and so forth for some of our engagement, but where possible we like to do it face-to-face. We call then for formal submissions on things that you'd like us to look at, and we then review those against our criteria. What we do initially is a screening on them to go, are these firstly safe and compliant with aviation regulations and standards? And then there's a few other criteria that we go, yes, they're feasible. If they're feasible, they then go into our flight path change program for a full assessment, environmental impact assessment, and community engagement. Because if we're changing, for example, the location of a flight path, we want to engage with the community on that. We won't just go and do it. I knew that would get a reaction. We then have a workshop where we unpack those options with you. So we don't just say, here's a report, we've done our bit, this is the end of it. We come to a workshop and say, okay, here's the suggestions we got and here's what our assessment said, and we give you the opportunity to challenge us on that, or to ask further questions, or interrogate why we've had that finding, or to say, all right, this one's going to work, what happens next? And then we put the report out for you to review and give us comments on that report. For this PIR, we've got obviously the community meetings and workshops will be our primary engagement tool. We also have Engage Airservices, which is a really, really important part of this. We want the community, with any PIR, we want the community to have access to the same information, everybody. So everything that happens gets put on that portal so that you can all see it. So that's the presentations, the videos, our fact sheets, any updated information, responses to questions that people ask. Even if they come in out of session, we'll put them up on Engage, and of course the submissions. Now, if you put in a submission about a potential suggestion, we put it up on Engage, but we de-identify it. So you don't have to worry about people seeing who's put the suggestion in, but we do share those suggestions with the entire community. All responses are provided on Engage Airservices. So if you wrote me a letter, I won't write back to you. I will put the questions on Engage with the responses, again, so everybody has access to that information. And that's just so we don't unfairly advantage or disadvantage different parts of the community by not having access to the same information. And anonymous submissions, we don't accept anonymous submissions. That's mainly because if somebody puts forward a suggestion, 9 times out of 10 we have to come back and ask for clarification. What is it that you're actually meaning by that? If it does this, would it address it? So for that reason we don't take the anonymous submissions. Now this is a bit hard to see. Again, you'll be able to look at it on Engage after this session, but this is pretty much the engagement program, and I'll just quickly walk through it. So we're going to do these meetings, as I said, put the terms of reference back out for a second round of review. We'll review your feedback, make any further updates, and our aim is to finalise the terms of reference by the end of November. Then we will provide, there's a couple of weeks then before that Christmas no-go zone. That's when we'll provide the information that I briefly mentioned before. So that's things like we'll provide information on the roles and responsibilities, the noise modelling versus actual results, some information on Brisbane operations, so what are the operating modes, how do the noise abatement procedures work, that kind of thing. Information on documentation, purpose and role. So some of the feedback we had on the terms of reference was that people are unclear about IRSAs and air racks and all of that kind of thing. So we'll put some information out on that. And also the complaint data. So what we've heard since the runway opened, looking at those key themes and where they might take us through this review. We don't expect you to do anything over Christmas. If you want to send us feedback over Christmas, you're certainly welcome to, but we won't be expecting that. We'll come back then after the Christmas period, over which our team will have done quite a bit of analysis of operations and so forth. And we're planning to have a series of workshops to help you come up with some ideas on actually for us to come up with ideas on how we can improve things. So we're not just going to say, okay, you go off and draw something and send it to us. What we want to do is do about probably 4 workshops. The first one will look at noise. The second one we will look at the operations and what the findings are, what's different to what we expected. Is it COVID? Is it not? How are aircraft behaving? And then 2 sessions where we start discussing suggested alternatives, where you can talk to people like Justin and say, you know, could you do this or could you do that, or what about this? And then, so the first one's kind of an initial one, and then the second one will be more of a deep dive once you've sort of crystallised your thinking a bit on it. And we've also had the opportunity to look at what we can do in terms of addressing some of those key points of feedback that we've heard. So moving on to the terms of reference. So we had 136 submissions on the terms of reference, and 32 of those had quite detailed submissions attached to them. I can absolutely guarantee I have read every single one of them, and so have members of my team, so they haven't just been pushed aside. We've actually got quite a good list of questions, but also people have already suggested some alternatives for us, which we've kept recorded to look at once we reach that part of the PIR. We've produced a summary of feedback document. I think it's sitting at about 65 pages, but we've got it categorised by topic, which has the comment made in your feedback and what our response to it is, and if it's resulted in an update to the terms of reference. We did actually get a lot of questions through the terms of reference, so a lot of them too are answers to some of those questions. The graph just shows where we've received submissions from. The first 2 are the areas that are close in to the airport, so north and south of the river, but close in to the airport. The next 2 are sort of within that mid-range, north and south of the river. And then the next 2 after that are sort of 15k or more away from the airport. And then we've got some people from the far northern suburbs, so that's like your Samford type area. We've got some from the far eastern suburbs, so out sort of around the Eastern Bay, sort of Cleveland type area, and then people from outside of the Brisbane council area, so up north, Moreton Bay type area. And again, you can have a look at this when we put it up on Engage. As I said, we'll put that response document up on Engage, and then you'll get another chance to look at it. Some of the updates. So people requested that we actually review the parallel runway operations, or the compass operations as we call it. So we've added that to it. We do note that a change to that operating, it's actually a part of Brisbane Airport Corporation's approval, is to operate with those compass operations because of where the airport's situated. It works. So for those of you who aren't incredibly familiar with that, basically the new runway takes aircraft from the north and the west, and the old runway takes it from the south and the east. And it kind of works because we're sort of smack bang in the middle of Australia, so you get the Sydney flights coming up and the Melbourne flights coming up to the old runway. Those coming from sort of the northern part come to the new runway. But we can review that, but we note it would be a change for BAC. It would probably require some sort of review at a government level, and it could also have some fairly significant efficiency outcomes, so it would have to be considered very carefully, but we've added it because we can have a look at it as part of this PIR. Requests to look at how we can reduce concentration of flight paths, so we've added that in. Review of permanent noise monitor locations. Some people wanted us to look at whether or not they're in the right place given the way the airport's operating. Opportunities to disperse flight paths in locations further away from the airport, so that's sort of your Brookfield, Samford area. Can we actually get a bigger splay of movements? Provision of fuel burn and emissions information. The high-level route structure, people ask why we can't review that. The reason we had that as out of scope was that we didn't actually change that structure through the project, so it wouldn't normally fall within our PIR. But if we've had a suggestion that required a change to that route structure, then we certainly would continue we'd be able to consider that. It doesn't rule it out. Temporary noise monitoring in some locations, so we've been asked if we can have some noise monitors, particularly Brookfield, Upper Brookfield area. We're actually working with Brisbane Airport Corporation on that because they've already got a temporary noise monitor that they're deploying. So we'll be sort of coordinating with them and providing that information. Review of operating modes and their implications for different communities. So people have asked, can we look at each operation and say, right, this affects this community, and it's at these noise levels and numbers. Review of frequency of operations to each runway. There was a new principle suggested, which is in there for comment when we put it back out, that increased air traffic, and I imagine this is over time, increased air traffic should be shared across the community. That BACAG and BFPCA be noted as stakeholders, so we've added them in that way, and that we provide clarification of technical terms, so we've done that as well. And our industry stakeholders have asked us to look for opportunities to reduce fuel burn or fuel consumption and emissions, a review of our STARS, so that's the arrival procedures to reduce complexity, and that industry-suggested alternatives also be considered consistent with the way we've worded it for the community. Now, just briefly, how am I going for time? I probably need to wrap it up. There are a few matters that we were going to clarify, but I think I'll hold that over because I want to get to the main presentation, and we'll put some of this up on our Engage Airservices portal. But I guess just a couple of quick things. We won't be reviewing or doing a new EIS. The EIS is not an Airservices document. We can't review it. It's not our document. So an EIS is done as part of a project approval. It's a statutory process, and once you do the EIS, the project's approved, we can't go back and change that. So we can't review it, but we can look at what was said in the EIS and how that compares to what people are experiencing. We're not going to do a complete redesign of the flight paths, but we will seek to implement improvements where we can. And once Justin will present sort of on what the flight paths look like and the complexity there, and that's why we won't do a complete redesign. It's extremely complicated, the way the airspace works, but as we said, we'll try to find some improvements. And the need for us to have an independent body do the PIR or the noise modelling. Airservices does these PIRs all of the time. It's part of our responsibility. This will be an open and transparent process. Where we make a decision, you will see what that decision is, and you'll have access to the information to understand why we've made it. And I guess just in closing and opening up for a few questions, I just want to note that the PIR, it won't fix everything. At the end of this process, the one thing that I can guarantee is that some of you may still have flight paths over your house. Brisbane we've got 2 runways to operate, and we can't make the flight paths go away. We can look to optimise over the bay operations. We can look to see where we can avoid communities by rejigging flight paths. We can look to see if we can put noise abatement procedures in to reduce impacts. Those are things we can do. We can't make the flight paths go away or the aircraft stop flying. So I just want to be completely honest with you about that. There will still be people who have aircraft flying over their houses at the end of this process. So I've talked enough. Any questions before we head into more detailed flight path design presentations? Prema will run around with the microphone. Please don't touch the microphone. Prema will hold it for you.
Sure. Testing.
Why should we have any confidence in this process, given that the ANO has just released a damning report showing that you didn't even follow your own guidelines last time?
Okay. Thank you for that question. It's a very topical question. We've reviewed the ANO's report, we've accepted the recommendations, and we're taking action against those recommendations. We have actually done a lot to improve our processes over the last 2 years. We've changed a lot of the way we do things, and we've reviewed our practice in that area. Our PIR is actually part of that process. We've introduced this PIR process. It's a new process that we've only been rolling out for the last probably 18 months or so, where we provide this an open and transparent engagement opportunity for the community. All I can ask is that you come on the journey with us, and hopefully we can prove to you that that's the experience that you'll have.
Donna, there's a question online.
Yep, sorry, Bridget.
So I've got 2 questions here about consultation. So one of them is, why were the affected communities not advised about the new flight paths during the planning phase and invited to be part of the discussion forums? So I'll let you do that one.
Okay. I'm not sure which affected communities. It might. I'm imagining that. Do we know if that's from outer suburbs, or we're not sure? Okay, so yeah, just here. Okay. I think one of the things like that, and again going back to the ANO report, the ANO found that Brisbane Airport Corporation implemented a well-resourced and extensive campaign. In the report, he also noted that there was a lot of focus, particularly on suburbs close in and not so much further out. And we acknowledge certainly the further out suburbs that we didn't do the engagement that we should have done out in those areas. But from our perspective, we believe there were opportunities there for people to learn about the flight paths. Could we have done better? Obviously, because there's... They gave us the wrong information and they did it deliberately. Yeah. So obviously, the fact that there's people who are upset, we didn't do a good enough job. And all we can do is take learnings from that and try to work with you now to move forward to address some of those issues. But...
I'm going to interrupt here. BAC made a statement that there would be more flights over the bay and less noise with the parallel runway.
Yep.
Why didn't Aircraft Corporation Australia make some comment at the stage of the EIS when you knew that not to be true?
Okay, so the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, did note that over the bay operations were a priority mode. They certainly did that, but they also noted there were several considerations around that, one of them being wind direction and also wet runway, those types of things, and also operating like movement levels. So there are a number of things that were in there saying, look, they will be prioritised, but here's the reasons we won't. No, just let me finish. Let me finish, please. Yep, I am. If you would let me get to it. Sir?
The question is, why didn't Air Corporation Australia, at the time of the EIS, tell us some truth about the increased noise that you were creating and how you were not having more flights over the bay?
So there are more flights over the bay now than there were before the second runway. There are. The ability to operate the two runways does allow more operations over the bay because you can use one runway to take off and the other one to land. So that's night time. That is what we're doing at night time. So we're... Yep. So... Okay. So... Yep. So the EIS also showed modes where aircraft take off on or land on one end of the runway and take off on the other end of the runway. They are the modes that are used primarily through the day because that mode where they come in and out over the bay on the two runways, it can only operate up to a certain traffic level. And then we have to switch for aircraft to come in over the bay and take off over land, or come in over land and take off over the bay, depending on wind direction. Aircraft like to land into the wind and take off into the wind. So that's why those modes were in the EIS. The EIS said, from what I've read in it, that over the bay operations would be between about 70 and 80% at night, which is consistent where it is at the moment. We're at about 73.7%, I think it is. Through the day, it said that it would be between, I think it was 0 to 10%, maybe 15% on busy days. So, sorry, that's the sod props. No, just sorry, let me clarify. So that's the sod props mode. So the sod props mode will work from at night time between through the day would be 0% to 10%. And then you've got your, Sir, if you keep interrupting, I'll have to ask you to leave.
Well, you may ask, madam. I would ask that you address the problem of fraudulent misreputation.
Okay, so I'm going to call... I'm trying to explain to you, but you're not listening, so I'm going to stop that discussion now. So what I would like to do is for us to move through the discussion tonight so that we can move forward to trying to address some of your concerns. Going back in history, we're not going to resolve it. The best opportunity for us to get some positive outcomes for this community is to move forward through this PIR, and that's where we need to share some information with you so that we can start working together. I understand that people are upset. I get that, but I want to be able to share the information with you and answer some questions productively. Prema, if you wouldn't mind going to the next person. Prema, to the next person, please. The ANO did not find any fraudulent representations. Yes, next question, please.
Testing.
Sir, there's other people. Sir, there are other people here who wish to speak. Please give your fellow community members an opportunity to speak. Sir.
Right, thanks. I've heard this statement, out over the bay, out over the bay, out over the bay, until I'm blue in the face. The thing is, even when they do head north, a lot of aircraft turn around and do this super tight right-hand turn and cut short under Mud Island and come round, and they come back over the land. There's even one flight path which is really weird, where they take off into the north and do this big loop that goes around and goes right over Wynnum and all those people that live there, and then head off north.
Yep.
I mean, if anybody's serious about talking about over the bay and taking off and reducing noise, you don't take off and then come back over populated areas.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, and Justin's presentation will probably show you a little bit about that, but I think that operation is one where, with wind direction, we're taking off over the bay, but the flight is potentially heading to the west, so it has to then loop around and come back over land to go to the west. But I'm not sure of exactly which one. But again, that's something that we can discuss through this and see if there's something that can be done. We'll look at that certainly in detail. I might just move on to Justin's presentation. I'm just conscious of time. Can we just get, what I'd really like to do if we can, is at least get through our flight path design presentation so that you can see what goes into that, and then we'll put it back to the community about whether or not you wish to learn about the noise and operations. So Justin, if I could just throw to you, please, to... Right. You're going to be on that one.
Hello. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Justin and I've worked for Airservices for 15 years. The last 13 and a half of that have been within the flight path design team as a flight path designer and instrument flight path designer. I'm going to take you through a few of the steps and considerations that we go through to put these flight paths together. It's very complicated, and I know a lot of people see one line in the sky and wonder why it can't be shift left or right. So hopefully my presentation does assist in understanding that, and some of the learnings that I'm hoping to give today are going to help you with any community suggested alternatives for the flight paths, which is going to be part of the PIR. So as Donna mentioned, safety is our #1 consideration through all of the design. Everything in aviation has this at the front and centre. There's two parts to the safety here. So the first one is the ICAO rule set for 8168, that's the taking off and the landing of aircraft. That has to happen super safe, and that is a non-negotiable. The second part of safety is the air traffic control that manage the aircraft in the Brisbane area. So when there's more than one aircraft in the area, which there will be, they have to be safely separated. They can't be side by side or close to each other. The risk of a collision is obviously catastrophic, and we do everything we can to make sure that that is not a possibility. So those two items are at the forefront of the design for safety. The second part is this sort of big consideration of all stakeholders. So the stakeholders are the community, efficiency of the flight paths, the airlines, the environment. This sort of all has to be looked at the same time, because you can't just sort of use one because it just breaks the rest of them. So it's this sort of process that looks at everything else. After safety's locked down, we see what the options are to just make the best of the situation. The process is typically, we would do a draft design, and then it goes through a lot of assessments. So the assessment is simulations by our air traffic controllers, simulations by the airlines. They fly the procedures to make sure that they're actually capable and safe to do so. We then rework with any suggestions, and anything that didn't work, we rework that. That can happen 1 time or 20 times until we get a design that we're really, really happy with. And then that goes to CASA as a detailed design ready for publication. CASA, our regulator, will then approve it, and then that becomes published and used in the real world. So some of the considerations and constraints that we have, like I said, safety is number one. The second one are things that we can't really change, which is where the runway is, the runway location. So that's all plays a huge part in the airspace design. Then we've got the other two parts of safety, which is the flight design rules and the ATC workload. So that's how all of these aircraft are going to use the flight paths in a safe manner. We've then got the direction of inbound and outbound flights. You know that flights come from America, from Asia, from Melbourne, from Cairns. They all sort of come into the terminal area through gates around the edge. Those gates have to be connected down to the runway depending on the weather. So if you're coming from America, you might just land straight in on the runway, or you might have to come around over the land and land into the wind. So all of these have to be designed to suit all weather conditions from all different directions. And all of a sudden you get a really, really complex picture in the Brisbane area. As well as that, we've got military restricted areas, which Amberley is out to the west a little bit. So that does impact on where things can go on that side of the basin. And we also have the stakeholder and community requirements. So that's the airlines, that's the community, that's the environment. So all of these are considered, and some of them, like safety, is absolutely concrete, and then some of them are quite flexible and they all have to work together. So starting with the most concrete constraint, and that is the runway. So the original runway, or the legacy runway as people refer it, was actually built in 1988, and that's the main one on the southern or the southeastern side of the runway of the airport. And then Brisbane Airport Corporation actually began a process in 2005 when they forecast air traffic levels were going to exceed what one runway was capable of, and that's when they began the development of the approval process and the development of the second runway, which is now parallel to the north. A parallel runway system is very common internationally for increasing the capacity of a runway, and that was the requirement here. So the orientation of these runways is just the main determining factor for where the flight paths have to come and go. And just for information, if you weren't aware, runway 19 is actually named that because it's 196 degrees magnetic, and 01 is 016 or 16 degrees magnetic. So that's where the numbering method comes from. Going on to how we would start a design. So the first thing we do, like I said, is we look at where the runway is and look at where that centre line comes out. So obviously we haven't got into the modes yet of over the bay, over the land, none of that just yet. We're just trying to get all of the sort of tracks that come in from around the basin into the runway. So we start by looking at what the final approach track is. There's departures that have to take off runway aligned, there's arrivals that have to come in runway aligned. So they're always going to sort of end up on those yellow extended centre lines that I've just drafted on that little Google Earth image. So just quickly, there's two types of sort of approach into Brisbane that are mainly used. Now we've got the RNAV and the ILS. I'll try to keep, this is going to be a little bit technical, I'll try to keep it as high level as I can and just explain why the flight paths do what they do. So an RNAV is a GPS approach, so the aircraft just has GPS satellites to navigate it to the ground. The ILS is actually an instrument that sits at the runway and points some information back to the aircraft that give it its lateral position, its vertical position, to make sure that it's going to come in straight to the runway. So both an RNAV and an ILS approach, they both start out and have quite a long straight arrival segment. This is required by those ICAO rules that I spoke of earlier. And because there's two runways, now they actually have to consider one another. So what we end up with is a vertical requirement, a difference at the start of the arrival. So we have a high side and a low side, and they're 4,000 feet and 3,000 feet. That's 1,000 feet different, or 300 metres different. That's the international standard that makes it safe to arrive. Now you can see the new runway is just slightly longer. That's the 4,000 foot approach, and the legacy runway is the 3,000 feet approach. Now they both have the same 3-degree arrival path. Now that's exactly what every aircraft wants to do, is a 3-degree arrival path. That's used at every single airport internationally. And 3 degrees might sound quite shallow, but anything as steep as 3.2 degrees is far too steep for an aircraft to actually use. So that's why exactly 3 degrees is used. And the length of those lines is dictated by where 3 degrees hits the certain altitude they start their approach at, whether it be 3,000 or 4,000 feet, which is 900 metres or 1,200 metres. There's a little red segment prior, that's also in the rule book. That needs to be used as a level segment for the aircraft to prepare to actually start their approach. And then the segment prior to that, which is this little hatched region, that's where aircraft can join onto these approaches and then be completely separated from each other in a way that they can both land at the same time, and safety is assured, separation is assured, and they do that landing very safely. So that's our longer approach. That can be used in low visibility There's a lot of guidance and automation from the aircraft and the runway here. So that's sort of the very normal, safe approach to an airport. Almost every runway in Australia has RNAV approaches, which are very similar length and runway aligned. The second type of approach is a really new one to the aviation industry, maybe around for 5 or 8 years in Australia. I don't know the exact number, but it's called RMPAR, and it's a curved approach. This allows aircraft to arrive much shorter onto the runway. So instead of starting a long way out straight, they can make a turn onto the runway at like sort of 2 or 3 nautical miles, which is about 5 to 6 kilometres. That's about the shortest they could absolutely do it. The difference is not every aircraft can use this approach. This requires authorisation from CASA to operate. That's the aircraft has to be authorised, and also the crew on board have to be authorised to use this approach. The next thing is that this approach, obviously as short as it is, not available to everybody, has to fit in with the rest of the picture of approaches here. So we've obviously got the long approaches for the aircraft that can't do this and the short approaches. We are at risk of making the airspace dangerous for an air traffic controller to manage if everything is doing something different. So this has to be carefully planned, and it can't always just be as short as possible. It has to fit with what the air traffic controllers are able to manage. So we've actually got an RMPAR approach onto each side, and it's just somewhere in the middle of that blue dashed area. But that's sort of the tightest it could be mathematically according to the rules, just to give you some idea of why there is long and short approaches and that sort of thing. So far I've shown you everything over the land. That's just because obviously that's the area of interest today. Everything over the bay is exactly the same, just mirrored. Those long approaches are the same over the bay. These RMPAR approaches have the same rule set over the bay. It could just be flipped up there just for information. Just getting on to departures now. So I've spoken about arrivals so far. Almost every arriving aircraft has a similar performance. Doesn't matter what the aircraft is. They come in at 3 degrees, they come in at the same speed, and they're all the same from an air traffic point of view. For a departure, the difference in aircraft body type, such as a propeller aircraft or a jet aircraft, they do things really differently, and it also depends on the weight of the aircraft. So if you've got a very small plane that's just going somewhere on the Queensland coast or New South Wales coast, they'll be able to do what we call the early turn. So this is a turn at an altitude. A turn at an altitude means that they get to a certain height that's safe from obstacles, and then they can start to make their turn. While they're turning, they will still be climbing as well. But if an aircraft is high performing, they get to that 600 feet altitude right at the end of the runway, and they're already starting their turn. And if they're small and light, they can turn quite tight. So that's what those earliest turns are depicting. The blue line in the middle, we call it the average flight path, meaning that this is where the majority are going to be, and we sort of can put this as our nominal track. And then we've actually got what we call the late turn. It's not late in a dangerous sense, it's just later than the normal turn. If an aircraft was going to go to, let's say, somewhere quite far away, America, the Middle East, and it's fully heavy, full of people, full of fuel, it's going to take a lot longer to get to its 600 feet as it climbs a lot slower than the other aircraft. And then it's also going to make its turn as if, I don't know, like a bus would make a turn, big and slow and heavy, whereas the small one's a sports car. So we've got lots of different performance types, and that's what actually comes out when we design a turn on a departure. We have this really big spread of traffic. Now, typically, wherever they end their turn, the next waypoint might be somewhere up here. They'll sort of all just directly go to that. So that sort of will become narrow, and then they'll be on their way. But that's just an example of the performance difference that we can expect on a departure. This really busy picture, I've just tried to show what we're actually using at the moment off the parallel runways in terms of departures and the performance of them. Now, the propeller aircraft and the jet aircraft, they can't be sent on the same air route, because if a propeller aircraft went off first and then a jet aircraft followed it, the jet would want to be flying a lot quicker than the propeller is actually capable of. So they end up getting stuck behind it and underneath it, and there's no way to get them above them to climb higher, because you can't get the separation standard, so there's a safety risk there. So we don't like to use the same track for a propeller, or a prop as we call them, as a jet aircraft. So as you can see here, what the design does is it turns the props instantly off the runway, and the jets would go straight ahead. They then get separated by a safe distance laterally that the jet can now outclimb the prop without having to be stuck behind it per se. And the reason that these two particular tracks are in this orientation is because if this jet is going to America, it has to actually climb quite high by about this point here. If you can imagine, the arrivals coming in over the bay would be about here. It has to jump them, so it has to have a vertical requirement of, I think it's something like 8,000 or 9,000 feet. Now, if we took them off here and did that, they would never get that altitude. So as such, the SID, or the departure, is designed to give them the altitude to climb over the arrivals and get them on the way to America. The props are typically going, I don't know, somewhere in Queensland or central Queensland, and that's why they're all heading out this way. They're underneath the jets all the time. So these jets are also jumping the props over here. So that's just a bit of a picture about why there's often two different departures, and that's why they are separated for those different performance categories. I'm nearly done. The last two slides I've just got for you now are just sort of an example. This one's the 0-1 configuration, and I'll show you 1-9 in a second, just to show you the massive considerations when all of these procedures are put on the screen at the same time. We've also got the consideration of this restricted area, so that's Amberley right there, and we've got the runways right here. We've got Archerfield is a small airport that exists just off the centre line down here, so that's another consideration. But we've got departures and arrivals. So the departures are in purple just here, and the arrivals in orange. Sorry if you can't see this, but you will see the pack once it gets released on Engage. So the arrivals are all coming in on orange here onto these approaches, and the departures take off as such. So we've got departures to the north or departures to the south in these directions. I think this departure was spoken of earlier. It's actually a very long-standing legacy departure. I think it's been around for about 20 years. And it's much preferred to a departure over land, because over the bay they actually get to about 10,000 feet by here, and they go back over the runway, so not near the city and so forth. So that was designed a long time ago, and where possible we were trying to make sure that would be retained, so that there was fewer people newly overflown by this change. This is the same picture, but with the wind doing the opposite thing. So this is now runway 19 orientations. This is arrivals coming in over the bay and departures over land. So we've got the departures to the south doglegging there, and then the departures that go to the north, east and northwest off this side. As you can see here, everything crosses over. We've got departures here and arrivals here. So these departures are held underneath these arrivals that are held above while they come in, because they've got a bit further to fly. Everything was quite designed with the whole situation in mind at the time. So to move this one line across to here, it means those arrivals wouldn't be able to get down, because they'd have to wait until they were past them, and then they'd have to descend too steep. So there's a lot of things that impact one another when you look at the whole design. I think that's all I have at the moment. I'm hoping that was educational to some extent, and yeah, willing to take questions.
Testing.
Yeah, thanks, Justin, for that. I've been operating obviously in Brisbane and other airports for well over 25 years, and I just do not understand why on 01 left you haven't put an R&P approach into a 2 mile final, which you do on right, and why they opted for closed stars. Now I understand, when I spoke to Neil Hall, he said that airlines wanted closed stars. When I talked to the people in the airlines that I work with, they want closer in R&P approaches, and they want closer departures as well, as particularly off 19 right. And it's not that jets can't do it. I've flown into Hong Kong, I've flown into a lot of airports around the world, and there are a lot, even Sydney has early right turns for jets when you do Maribs and things like that. So I understand when he said it was due to the EIS we couldn't change things, but you've got visual approaches coming in with Dash H, you've redesigned an R&P approach recently onto the old runway, or the legacy runway coming in from the north, which used to be the river track, which is now an R&P approach. Right. Yes. And there is no reason why you cannot design a state type arrival R&P approach onto the new runway, just to spread that noise around, rather than concentrating everything over here on both that H and whatever that other entry point is. And I just, the Airservices Charter says that you'll adopt new technologies. And I know R&P wasn't around back in 2001 or earlier than that when this all happened, but it is here now, and we can do much more efficient both environmentally and for noise abatement purposes. I don't see why it's not being adopted, that's all.
Yes. Yeah, and we can certainly look at that through this process. There's no reason we can't look at that. So it's a valid thing to raise. And did you want to say anything to that briefly, Justin?
I do have a memory of why the short onto 01 left was actually not available halfway through our design. So that was one of the initial design points. We did have that close arrival there. What we did was extensive testing with, I think it might have been Boeing in the US, of all of our approaches, and the way that both of the RMPARs were coming onto final at exactly the same point, the aircrafts were getting a lot of TCAS alerts, which is a traffic collision avoidance system that would come into play as they almost had to fly nose to nose before turning on together. So what we had to do was move one offset so that they actually come in separately. That solved a huge safety issue. When they had TCAS alerts, it got more significant than just alert because aircraft would start to take their own action to avoid a collision. So we couldn't have them both coming in at exactly 2 miles. So I think now we have a 2 and a 4 mile or something like that, which is what we had to do, a change just for safety reasons so that these are basically available independently. And it was the shortest approach we could do that was safe.
Sorry, you can't be heard because you haven't got the microphone. But is it all right if we get to acknowledge your point, and it's something that we can certainly look into in more detail?
Please submit it as some of the feedback to the forum, and it will be investigated, absolutely.
So another question down the back there, Prema, and then there's a couple down the front here.
Yes, thank you. 2 points of clarification. One is the Airservices Act 1995, which is the piece of legislation that you guys are bound by. In Section 9, it says that, as you just outlined, safety is the #1 priority. But the second priority is protecting the environment, which is all of us. I don't see how you're doing this, and you're constantly using words like optimization of capacity. That's great for the airport, but it's not great for us. So I, first of all, don't see how, in terms of the legislation that you're bound by, you have a remit to do the dirty work for the airport. The second question is about a number of ATCs that have been talking to BFPCA and blowing the whistle on what went down when these flight paths were designed by Scott Turner, the lone ATC sitting away at his desk designing that dog's breakfast, as they called it, on your Prune forum, the kind of aviation professional forum where you guys are talking to each other. So the reason why it's called a dog's breakfast is because you've been blindly optimizing these flight paths for a capacity of 110 flights an hour to give BAC the optimal commercial capacity that is in line, as the CEO of BAC is saying, with Hong Kong and Singapore. First of all, it's not needed, but second of all, the ADCs have been actually arguing to executive management of Airservices that they wanted independent parallel operations where you would have one runway used for arrival, the other one for departure, and then you would swap. That would give people a respite, you would have proper noise sharing, and you would get a similar capacity that is adequate for Brisbane of up to 85 flights an hour. So why wasn't that done?
Okay, so I'll take that one. Firstly, I just want to address this. It's almost become an urban myth that one person designed these flight paths. Absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. We would never have one person design flight paths for an airport like this. There are a team of flight path designers, there were operations people, there were reviews done by independent parties. It was not designed by one person, and Scott Turner does not deserve to be singled out. He's been singled out quite a bit on social media, and it would really be good if that ceased. Yep. So, but he doesn't deserve.
Your predecessor put those media releases out there.
Yep.
On their website, and now it doesn't suit you anymore.
No, he was promoted for winning an award, and that's appropriate, but it's not appropriate that he's vilified for doing his job. He is just doing his job. Not one of the flight path designers or operations people who have been involved with this design have set out to deliberately do the wrong thing by the community. They haven't. As Justin just showed, the airspace is quite complicated. They have to jump and go below. And so they have designed safety first, absolutely. But where they have been able to move things so that they don't necessarily fly over the most populated area of a community, they've done that. Maybe there's some opportunities now to improve that, but they have not set out to deliberately do the wrong thing by the community. There's somebody else here who's got... So you've already had a question. Can I let someone else ask a question, and I'll come back to you at the end. I'll come back to you at the end. So, Prema, sorry?
You keep talking about safety, but in that presentation that you just did, you didn't mention the safety of the community that's being flown over, our health and safety, our families that are being flown over, our workspaces, our home life, our lifestyle that's being ruined by these planes. Can you please address that?
So our flight path designers, their number one priority is aviation safety, aircraft safety. Whenever you or I get on an aircraft, it has to be the safest possible place. It's the number one priority. It doesn't mean that the community are ignored, but if we've got a choice to make, between having a safe flight path over a community and an unsafe flight path somewhere else, we will go with the safe flight path every single time, because when people take air travel in Australia, it has to be safe, and that is our number one priority. But appreciate that we also need to consider the community, and we do try to do that. Last year we released some flight path design principles to try and show how we do try to balance the needs of community, the efficiency of the industry and so forth, but even they say safety number one, and it always will be. So,
Safety. What we're disputing is your prioritisation of industry over community.
yep. So yes, you're correct. When we go to design flight paths, we look at what the airport's trying to achieve, and we design to meet that efficiency level or that capacity level that they've received approval for through their project approvals. But we can still work with the community to see where we can get some improvements. That's what we're here for. But yes, we work with airport partners to design what they need to make their runways work. That's right. Oh, sorry, we've got a question over here. Sorry, I keep forgetting about you, Bridget. Sorry.
So I've got a number of questions here about density. So they're asking why can't flight paths be directed over less dense areas, so meaning more rural areas rather than high density living areas.
Okay, I'll take the first bit. I don't know if you've got anything to jump in with this, Justin, but the fact with like Brisbane Airport, we've got a city that is close to the airport. I think Bulimba is around about 5 kilometres from the runway end, roughly. As Justin mentioned before, when the runway orientation is the number one determining factor of flight paths for that initial probably 10 to 15 kilometres, and they have to be runway aligned. So if the runway points this way and there's a suburb here that's within 5 to 10, maybe 15 kilometres, chances are it will be overflown, because we can't. Departures, there's a bit more flexibility, they can turn off quicker, but on arrivals they have to be runway aligned around about 10 to 15 kilometres from that runway end. So if you line up with a runway, if there's built up areas that line up with the runway, lots of houses, then they will be overflown because of that fact. One more and then we'll go back to the...
Yeah, sure. So I've also got another one about sharing noise. So asking why could you design more flight paths or routes so that the noise could be shared across more areas?
Yep, and that's noise sharing is one of the elements that we've got in the terms of reference. We'll look to do that, and that will be something we can look at as part of this review. We probably wouldn't necessarily want to introduce more flight paths, because that would add more complexity, and probably Kate's operation people wouldn't appreciate that. But if we can do something with the existing flight paths, maybe we do put a new flight path in further out or something. But it is part of noise sharing is part of our terms of reference, and it will be looked at. Another question from the audience?
Look, first I want to say I'm very frustrated with your presentation, especially Donna. You know, respect us as a community, and a bit of humour at the start wasn't appreciated. Justin, in the function of, you know, flight pathways, and I appreciate what you're saying, and it is a complex thing, we all recognise that. The concern of the community is the volume of air traffic. You know, I think the gentleman in the back, great question by the way, and wasn't answered. He spoke about the charter about community and safety. We're all about safety, but the next one's community, not efficiency. Justin, is it the fact that you're trying to stretch all this volume of aircraft into this runway system that you're enabled to provide alternatives in terms of flight paths, facilitate things like curfews, consider things about the community in terms of the volume that these poor people, and we're all here They're sitting there every night hearing flight after flight after flight, right? That's what they're all upset about, including myself. Is the charter going to be to review, to cap the amount of flights? So this great pamphlet says, reduce the amount of flights, consider the complexity, and I'm so sorry it'll take more work, my apologies, but the complexity around providing more flight paths to distribute the noise. Thank you.
Okay, so the idea of a curfew or a movement cap isn't part of this review. Airservices can't implement that. It's not within our remit or our responsibility. That's a Department of Infrastructure things that we can't review something that we can't implement. There's no point us saying, let's review it when we can't do anything about that. So that won't be part of it. Justin, in terms of flight paths, and you'll have to come over near the microphone.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of adding flight paths to maybe try to spread the noise, that's what we want to get out of this PIR. If it is possible, if there's suggestions that are sound and safe and work, that's certainly something we're going to be looking at as part of this PIR.
Sorry, you've already addressed that already. I mean, you said it took years to come up with the flight paths. If that was, Justin to answer, if that was a possible scenario that you're now suggesting to this group of people, why hasn't it already?
There's not a lot of flexibility in certain areas. If there is flexibility and the community suggests an alternative that maybe our assessment, we're sitting at our desk trying our hardest to make it work to the best that we think it can. If there's something that we can understand from this session that changes that, we're willing to look into it, is what I'm meaning.
So one more question up the back and then I'll go back to online.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all that. I just want to know that the Board of Airservices Australia has given an undertaking to the Ombudsman that they will provide reasonable opportunities for community contributions and consideration of community-suggested alternatives to the current flight paths. How does Airservices Australia intend to meet this obligation, and to what extent will Airservices Australia accommodate changes to flight paths which result in environmental impact being closer to that foreshadowed in the environmental impact statement?
So our board has made a commitment to do exactly what the Aircraft Noise Ombudsman has requested. The PIR was actually underway before that recommendation came in. And as I said before, it's a core part of our PIR. If we can find safe and feasible improvements that reduce noise, we'll definitely do it, 100%.
Applied by ASA to their environmental assessment was flawed.
Okay, so the ANO didn't review the EIS. The ANO reviewed Airservices' final flight path design environmental assessment. So we will be looking at that. So one of the presentations, which I'm not sure we'll actually get to tonight, so we'll put it up online. Is about the noise monitoring or the actual versus modelled. So we'll be doing that comparison, seeing where it doesn't line up and seeing if we can do something to fix it, which would bring it back into, as you say, into line with what we had modelled when we did those final flight paths. So, yep, definitely looking at that. And we'll also be looking at what the BAC EIS said to see if there's anything there that we're out of kilter as well in terms of actual, and see if there's something we can do about it, definitely. Sorry, one more online and then...
So I've got one here for Justin about the design. So just asking about the approach angle and saying that there's examples of steeper than 3 degrees approach, including overseas.
Sorry? Okay, yeah, we're just... Okay, so, sorry, we can't answer every question online, so we're picking ones that, like the 3 degree question would probably be something that others would be asking, can we go steeper than 3 degrees? So, Justin, is it possible to design to have a steeper than a 3 degree descent, because apparently some other airports do that?
Yeah, as I said earlier, steeper than 3 degrees is very, very rare and unlikely. And when it is steeper than 3 degrees, it's like 3.1 or something like that internationally. Anything steeper, the airlines won't fly that at all. It's beyond their window of operation.
Yep, and every question that's online will be answered. We will be answering it on our Engage page. So, and what we're doing too is we'll take some of these questions and weave them into the future meeting presentations so you can see what the answers are to those as well. So we're not trying to be disingenuous here. We're trying to answer what, understandably, you have a lot of questions, which is why I just wanted to check. We're like 15 minutes from the end. We did have a presentation to give on the operation of the airport or the runways from an ATC perspective, and also the noise. Would you prefer to continue just with the question and answer and not worry about those presentations for now? Okay, fine, that's good. Okay, Prema, next question.
Curfews you said you couldn't address. How can that be addressed?
As I said, that's a Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications matter, so that would be something you would have to take up with them. It's not something that we can do. Oh, they'll certainly know that it's been raised in this forum, yes. They're a stakeholder in the post-implementation review and they'll be informed of what the feedback is. Yes, so a curfew in Australia only, I think it's Sydney, Adelaide, Gold Coast and Essendon airports have curfews. They're the only 4 in Australia that actually have a curfew. A curfew also doesn't mean that there's no flights. It just means that I guess your passenger jets can't land at those airports at night, which is a big difference, obviously. It removes the passenger jets from the mix. But even under curfew conditions, they still have freighters land at night. They still have lighter aircraft like your private jets land at night, and helicopters, emergency vehicles and so forth. But there are only 4 in Australia that have that curfew. Another question?
One of the main constraints that's thrown at us is the tailwind aspect. Now, how is that, who decides that? I mean, just a case in point, Saturday morning I live at Portside. Saturday morning from about 6 to 7:30, whatever, there were a number of flights that took off to the south, and then within an hour they were landing from the south. And I can't understand that there was such a big change in wind speed within that 45 minutes for that to happen.
So CASA is the one that determines that as the safety regulator, so it's up to them what the tailwind is. That 5-knot tailwind is consistent with international standards. There are a couple of airports, I think, that do have a slightly higher one, but not very many. Certainly none in Australia, so it's CASA that regulates that. In terms of that operation, it could be one of 2 things. It could be a wind change, but it could also be due to the number of aircraft that were projected to come in the next hour, that they had to switch from doing that sod props sort of both in and out over the bay to move to a in one end, out the other operation because the volume of air traffic was picking up. They have to make that decision in advance. They don't just do it when suddenly there's 20 aircraft lined up to come in. They look at what the schedule is and go, okay, we have to switch. But they could be the 2 reasons that may have happened. I think, Kate, do you have anything to add to that, or is that?
No, I just want to say that what Donna said is exactly right. We've always said in this presentation and this meeting that safety is the number 1 priority, and we are actually we have a Part 172 Manual of Standards, which is a certificate that we have from CASA, and that's our operating licence. Sorry, and it's our operating licence, and we have to abide by the regulations from CASA, and if we don't, they can remove that licence or indeed not recertify us when it's up for renewal. So we have to abide by those. And as Donna's just said, it's the 5 knots the limitation of tailwind is 5 knots, and that's on a dry runway. When it's a wet runway, the tailwind is 0, so we can't take any tailwind whatsoever. And I won't go on because I let other people answer questions. But as Donna said, when we're changing aircraft around, the complexity of the airspace, especially during the day, when we've got Sunshine Coast Airport open, and we've got arrivals and departures into Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast, and we've got RAAF Amberley open and Archerfield. A lot of those things impact the complexity of it, and that's why we can't always do the over-the-bay operations as well. So it's complexity, traffic mix, and safety, and what are the regulations we have to abide by from the regulator CASA.
Okay, have we got another question? Probably over this side somewhere, Prema.
Donna, I assume that Airservices Australia has a reasonable understanding about the level of community angst. Right. So what I've heard tonight is what you can't do. So you can't look at the EIS, you can't look at curfews, you can't look at caps. I'm not sitting here with a lot of confidence that out of this PIR, the community is going to get any sort of outcome that's acceptable. So if you roll forward, what is it that ASA may be able to do to address the significant problem that our community faces?
The answer to that will probably depend where you live, but I'm assuming you're all, Bulimba, Balmoral, Hawthorn. In terms of... No? Okay, well, I won't assume that. So in terms of people who are in that closer in runway aligned section, there's not a lot we can do, to be honest, because the international requirement, the standard is that aircraft have to be runway aligned. So in terms of those approaches, probably not a lot we can do. Departures, we've got a bit more flexibility because they can turn a little bit earlier, so there might be some opportunities around that. Noise abatement procedures to change the way things operate and the times of day, we can look at that. People that are further out, there's a little bit more flexibility because once you're sort of further out from the airport, we don't have that runway alignment requirement that kind of does create a constraint. And so there are more opportunities out there. So there are opportunities for change, but as I said at the beginning, we can't stop the aircraft flying over everyone's houses, but if we can find an improvement, we will find it. And we're not just relying on you. Yes, we want your suggestions. Yes, we want to know where you want us to improve things. We're looking at the complaint data, so we're not waiting for you to tell us again. We have heard that your complaints, and we'll be looking to see if we can make some improvements as well. And that's why we want to do that workshop series, so that we can actually work through it with you and say, oh, look, we can't do this, but we could do this, or if we did this. So we do want to work with you to see if we can find some improvements. Prema's up the back. Sorry, Prema's got the microphone. She'll come to you next, sir, if that's okay.
When there was just the original legacy runway, was it 5 knots then, the wind knots?
I'm not sure, I can't answer that.
Yeah.
It was 10, was it, Jess? So it was 10 knots.
Okay, so if that's a world standard, why was it 10 before and now it's 5? Because when it was just the legacy, I lived in Seven Hills, and that was a flight path. They weren't that often. Now in Bulimba, the ones that even use the legacy at night turn and come just below, like Hawthorn. So it's all night, it's all day. So really, how can you change something from 10 knots to 5? Oh, because it's international standard. You're saying that, oh, well, we didn't care before?
No, I think, and Kate, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I think was it a trial or something, and then, I don't know, we applied to CASA to keep it, and CASA said we couldn't or something. I'm not sure. Can you answer that?
Yeah, I'll try and ask it the best I can. I've been at Brisbane only since January, so I'll try and answer it the best I can. So there was a 10-knot tailwind that was allowed when we only had one runway, but there was different rule sets and regulations around it. But it was only to do when we had one runway. Now we have 2 runways. The actual rule set around that is actually different. So why? I'd have to take that on notice for you, and it's something we could potentially speak to the regulators about and get some more background information, because I don't want to mislead you and say anything that isn't potentially not true. But yeah, so it was 10 knots when we had the single runway. At times, I can't give you the specific details, but yeah, it has changed since we've had the parallel runways. I don't know. Does anybody know what the tailwind is in Hobart? Is it 5 knots still? Yeah. I'll find out for you, definitely. We'll find out and get back to you.
I think there's a correction needs to be put in here that there always were 2 runways, north, south and east, west. The main runway is the legacy runway, but shifting all the small and the turboprops into the 2 parallel runways has caused a lot more two different direction runways.
So for the people online who didn't hear that, it was that previously Brisbane Airport did have two runways. It's just one was a cross runway, and the turboprops, etc., could potentially use that cross runway, which meant that there wasn't such a load going over the city, over the newly affected suburbs. Is that what you were saying? That it was spread more because, and that's right, and that you could have a higher tailwind because you had the runways operating in a different sort of orientation to each other. Sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase. If you wait for the microphone, I won't have to do that. So I've just got one more question online, and it's not being Dorothy Dixon, but we'll just answer a question.
So I've got a number of questions around noise relief, sorry. So they're a combination of saying that if people have to wait for the PIR to be completed, that could be a long period. So is there something that could be done more immediately? And then a couple more general questions about whether there's any mitigation that we can do, such as noise abatement procedures or insulation.
Okay. So yeah, with any flight path changes that come out of the PIR, they will take a lot longer to implement because, as I said earlier, they have to go through a full environmental assessment and then through engagement. So they will, and obviously the design process and then approval through CASA and so forth. So they can be like a 12-month thing. Where we can find things like noise abatement procedures and other things that we can implement more readily, we will seek to do that during the PIR. So if there's something that we go, if we do this, it's going to result in an improvement over here, and we can do it, we'll do that during the PIR. Was there another part of that question I haven't answered? Insulation. So that's not something that we're looking at as part of the post-implementation review.
Why not?
It's not something that we look at. Airservices doesn't do insulation on houses. We're an air navigation service provider, so we design flight paths, operate the air traffic control and operate the firefighting service. We don't do home insulation. I'm not sure about that. I can't comment on that. Okay. Okay. All right. Right. Right, so for people online, there was a lady who's just advised that there was some insulation done in Coolangatta because of aircraft coming in quite low, so it may be the case there. Question at the back there, Prema?
Could I just ask, is Airservices Australia accountable to any federal department? I love the federal government. And if you are, which department are you accountable to?
Yep, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communities.
So therefore, is it not logical for us to ask if that department is responsible for things like curfew, for you to recommend to the department that the population here are concerned about the noise level and would like consideration given to curfew?
We'll certainly be sharing any. The department's obviously very interested in the post-implementation review. They're aware of the level of community angst, and so they will be kept up to date, and they'll be advised of what the feedback is we're getting from the community and monitoring the progress quite closely, as will the advisory forum that's been put together by government. Prema, another one down there.
Thanks. Donna, I don't live in this area, I live at New Farm, and you don't have a consultation meeting in that part of town. But the point that you made about if you're in the direct line of the flight path, there's not going to be any change. We went from, if I can just stop speaking a minute, to less ambient noise than that, to between 65 and 72 decibel flights going over the top of our house, right? We didn't buy into that. So you're telling me now that actually nothing really is going to change for me and my family. So we need to put our house on the market and sell because it's intolerable. And so the point that I'd like to make is that in consultation, and you might consider this in the future, progressive places like the United Kingdom for high speed 2 actually had acoustic modelling that the community could go and they could click on a map to say, I live here, this is what the noise is going to sound like, right? So are you considering that sort of thing?
So you actually heard the sound as opposed to just seeing a level?
Not only are they told, which I was never told, and I've been there since 2005, but you can actually experience it. Okay. And if you're serious about communicating to the community about what the impacts are, that's the sort of thing that you need to do. And also, so I guess, I don't know how many people here are in New Farm, but the impact there has been phenomenal. From 0, as I said, to that ambient noise with no sound at all, to between 65 and 72 decibels. And your organisation told me to stop submitting complaints, by the way.
So I think in terms of what we can do in those areas, we can still look for some improvements. There's in the terms of reference, we've got things like noise sharing, looking at if we can reduce the concentration of some of the flight paths, noting, as per Justin said, there are some aircraft that naturally do that RNP technology. We can look at noise abatement procedures and things like that. So there are still some things we can do. Are we likely to completely remove the flight paths at New Farm? I don't think so. I don't know, though. I'm not a flight path designer, so maybe there are opportunities to shift slightly or to do some sort of improvement. We'll look to that as part of this. There was another part of your question I was going to address, and I can't think what it was. So it might. Oh, sorry, the noise demonstration. That's actually sounds like a really a good thing, and that's something that we'll take on board. If there's technology that can do that, you're right. That's the sort of thing that we should be moving towards in engagement to show so that people can actually hear rather than just try to interpret a contour or something like that. So really good idea.
Thank you. Just for future reference, this feels like a training and development program, not a consultation. So I'd just put that to you. I think most people in this room have researched this to death. And we've got other careers. We didn't seek to be pilots or designers of runways and whatever. That's your job. And you need to do something for this community.
Sorry, if I'll just address that and then you can have your second question. The purpose of this meeting is not intended to be the PIR consultation session. This is just about the terms of reference. We want to share with you some information that will help you when you're looking at the terms of reference, that you've got some background. If you already know it, our apologies, but there may be people in the room who don't have that information, and we're wanting to give people information that means that they can engage with us meaningfully as we move forward. So that's the purpose of tonight. The sessions that we hold during the PIR will be very collaborative and interactive, and they won't be us standing up here and talking at you. They will be more like tables with things like that.
Need to move this along. We're struggling with time. But just to substantiate the previous speaker, I do live near one of the noise monitors, and the noise that we get is on average around 71 decibels. And that's 843 arrivals, not even counting departures. And that was only over an 11-day period when I went into BAC's website. That's akin to a petrol lawnmower at 15 metres or less, coming over all the time, frequently. This is getting worse. You're suggesting this groaningly long process that we've got to keep participating in, which suggests to me that you're hoping there'll be good community attrition. We won't go away, and we understand completely how Commonwealth politics works, and we understand the department you work for. I've Googled the board, I've looked at how long your CEO was in the job to try and understand how all of these people can put us in this position. And I can tell you, I've been here for 40 years and I was part of the original group around this parallel runway, so I know exactly what was said. We were assured by Kuhn Runemans that 80% of incoming and outcoming would be out over the bay. We were treated like a silly community for our concerns. I also know that the BAC and the Noise Ombudsman report validated this about the last consultations with the EIS. I think you've got to be aware, this is like watching paint dry. We are in absolute anguish over this problem.
Okay, I'll take that as a statement. Thank you. Do you want me to go to one more and then we'll go to online again?
I don't have a lot of faith that there'll be changes to the flight paths. I'm just worried now of the impact when, after COVID, we have increased capacity. What does Justin think? You know, what's the likely scenario in the future?
Yeah, that's something we're going, as I mentioned earlier, we'll look at during the first phase. We'll look at what we think the industry is going to do. It could actually be very different to what we initially thought it would be. We could be, I don't know, maybe operating at 80% of what we used to have pre-COVID. Not sure at this stage, but that will be part of the information we share during the PIR. The other thing, just to quickly note too, is because of the border closures down south, most of the travel, not all, has been intrastate, so it's been within Queensland because we haven't really been able to travel anywhere else. And so that has meant that the new runway has got a lot more use because it's the one that those intrastate flights travel to. So you may not necessarily see an exact doubling of numbers. But again, I don't know what that looks like. We're going to share that information with you as we go through the PIR. Have you got another question, Bridge?
So I've got some questions here about participating in the PIR. So the first question is Airservices consulting with the community or just informing? And then the second question is, during the PIR, how can people provide feedback on the quality of the community engagement?
Okay. So we will definitely be consulting, not just informing. So as I said, we want to do those more interactive sessions to try and almost, co-design some solutions if we can. We're not just going to say, give us your feedback and we'll go into a dark room and spit out some sort of arbitrary answer. We will be genuinely engaging with you in that. Sorry, I've forgotten the second question. How they can provide feedback. So our Engage portal, you can provide feedback at any time. You can ask questions at any time. There's mechanisms in there to do it. In terms of identifying suggestions, we welcome any feedback you want to give us. We're obviously going to review complaint data and identify some things from that. But if there's other feedback you want to send in, you can do that via Engage. You can put submissions up there in terms of suggested alternatives, but most of it will actually come from face-to-face meetings. Again, not us talking at you, us sitting at tables with you and having a discussion around what can happen.
The portal doesn't work.
Well, it should do.
Can I give you an example?
Yep.
In signing up to participate in this process, not only was I not given information about this process, but you started sending me the information from Hobart.
Okay, we have had the...
When I contacted Airservices
Yep.
about that, I was told I had to go and do it all over again, that you can help me.
Yep, so we have had a few people that have raised that. And what has happened is that when the people like yourself had gone in to register, for whatever reason, you registered against Hobart, not Brisbane, or maybe you registered against Hobart. We've investigated it. All I can tell you is what we've found. You were registered for Hobart, and we can't actually change that at the back end. We even contacted the software providers, and they have said we can't change it, that you have to, because I guess they've designed it that way so we can't just boot someone out of getting information on something. So we physically cannot take you off Hobart, but you can go in very easily and deregister yourself from Hobart. So it's just the way the system works. It's not deliberate.
You can't go in and very easily deregister yourself because I tried.
Okay, well, can I send you some instructions on how to do that, or did you already have those?
I've already tried.
Okay.
Can we send them to the lady separately?
Yep.
To your email address?
No, she's already been given the address. Yeah. Okay. I'll grab your details after the meeting and I'll see if I can help you. I'll get someone to help you see if you can deregister from that. Remo? Okay. Okay. Yep, I'll take that feedback. I'll see if our providers can do something for that. So there's just a question in the middle there, then I've got two down here, and then I will go back to you, sir, because I know you had another question.
So BAC is the client at the back of the room. Their priority is to maximise capacity through the airport, which therein lies the safety issues that are at the top of the priority list. Noting, of course, in Justin's presentation, safety was number one, as it should be. community was at the very bottom of that list. It was about a 10-point dot list. So clearly that's where the priority lies, and that's where the safety issues lie. So if that's your priority, to make sure that you're satisfying your clients' requirements, then, as you said, there's very little you're ever going to be able to achieve through a flight path redesign if the priority is to maximise operations, which brings the complexity, which brings the safety, which undermines our livability in this city.
There's obviously competing priorities. Yes, there are. There's a number of them that we have to juggle, but yes, safety number one, but then there are competing priorities. Just for clarity though, Brisbane Airport Corporation aren't our customer, that we don't get money from Brisbane Airport Corporation. Airlines pay our fees, so we actually work to create the flight paths so that the airlines can fly to and from wherever they need to. That's where we get our revenue from. It's not from BAC, so we're not beholden to BAC, but they are a strategic partner in aviation. One of our requirements under the Act is to foster the growth of aviation, and so working with partners like BAC, yes, that's something we look at, but we do also look at the community impact, and that's something that we're here to do through this. Oh, sorry, Kate.
I just wanted to talk about some of you have said that you've not really got much hope that the noise levels are going to improve. Now, I can't, because this is a PR, the terms of reference and a PR process that we're going through. And as Justin and Donna have both said that if it's operationally feasible and safe to do so, we'll implement it. One of the things I wanted to touch on, which I didn't present to you, and I understand why, was the various modes that we have at Brisbane Airport. And I'm sure that majority, if not all of you, know about all the modes, because obviously you were saying to me that you've researched it for a long time. Now, there are different modes that we can employ. And so I don't want you to lose hope that there's nothing that can be done, because we've talked about potential noise sharing. There's the parallel runway ops, which is the number one mode during the day, which we get the highest arrival rate from when we talk about efficiency. But there are also other modes which people have alluded to, and which are segregated ops, where you can have, and I know some of you have talked about the UK, there are places around the world where you have departures off one runway and arrivals on the other, and then you swap them around to relieve the noise. That is some of the modes that we do have, and it is within our modes. Was it in the EIS? I can't remember. The segregated ops, was it in the EIS? I can't remember. But it is one of the modes that we have. So there is some hope, and like Donna has said, we can't probably remove the flight paths for locations who are 5 miles in, but there is the potential to relieve that for portions of the day. So if that helps, that's something that we can definitely look into doing as well.
Thanks, Kate. We are getting out. We are out of time. There were 2 questions down here and then 2 against the wall over there, so I'll take those and then we might have to wrap it up.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, is in essence what you're saying, that the only way to really help people like us who are in that line of the landing aircraft is to use sod drops, but so that the things are over the bay, so takeoff and landing is over the bay. So, and that would seem to be impacted by the capacity of the runways, or the capacity of the airport, and also the tailwind. It's just, there has to be some sort of hope for people, Bulimba, Hawthorn, Balmoral people who are just in that line.
Yeah, so there's just a slide that I'm going to bring up on here. That one, yeah. It is quite small, and I'm sorry if you can't see it. Those are some of I've just put the typical modes up there, not every single one, because there's quite a few. And I just wanted to talk to, so there is sod props, which you were talking to, and that is a capacity and a tailwind limitation on that. Whereas the segregated ops, if we go down to the bottom, this is what I was talking to, is this is potential. This is a mode that we have already got written, and that's where you can do arrivals to one runway and departures off the other. So if you just go to the left, therefore you get your arrivals onto 01 left, and your departures would go off 01 right, which obviously you can then swap around during the day depending on the weather and the traffic levels. It potentially isn't something we could do all the time because of the traffic levels and the arrivals rates that we'd have, but it would increase noise sharing for the community. And sorry, I forgot to say, and there's also the 191 as well, so the southerly direction, when aircraft are landing and taking off in the southerly direction and taking off and landing in the northerly direction. Did anybody have any follow-up questions on that?
Sorry, we might come back to that. I've just said there's a couple of people I've said we'll get to. And then the two against the wall, Prema.
Hi, thanks for taking the question. My name's Peter, and I get that this is complicated. I get that you've got a process. I think everybody in this room likes to travel. We all probably going to use the airport at some point. My point is that I live in Hawthorne for about 16 years. A year ago it was fine. Now I'm the most tolerant person in the world. I'm a Canadian. We're famous for being tolerant. Justin, Kate, Donna, Prima, like the noise at my house is crazy. I don't know who was responsible for coming up with the plan of how the runway was going to work. That doesn't matter anymore. It's happened. The airport's going to keep operating. Can you please, when you're going forward from now, think about how you can reduce the noise in the areas like New Farm? Like, I don't know, I'm not a student of this. I've spent way more time at this meeting than I ever wanted to. I just want to make the point that the noise is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. I don't want to go to a workshop and figure out modes of operation. It's way beyond my interest level. That's all I want to say.
Yep, thank you.
It's crazy the situation we got ourselves in right now.
Yep.
The planes are coming right down the city, down the river, over New Farm, Hawthorne, Balimba, like they're using my house as a tracking device to find the airport.
Yeah.
So it's not. It sounds like a complaint from an idiot. I know I must sound crazy.
No.
And I'm very tolerant. I don't understand how this happened. Can you try and figure out how to do something? And I really don't. I couldn't stand going to a workshop. I'd rather.
Yeah, don't say it.
It's not. Justin clearly knows what he's doing. There's no question. Yeah, just can we? It's a real issue. It's not something some mad guy is complaining from up in the sky. It's.
Yep.
It's a plea. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Prema, just the gentleman at the side there with the blue check shirt, and then the gentleman behind him, please. Thank you.
And the consultation between BAC and ACA has been unbelievably, and you gave us the word, disingenuous. And I'm afraid ACA are still particularly disingenuous.
Okay, well, I'll take that as a comment, but again, as I said to the lady that raised that before, all I can ask is that you work with us through this process. We're not here to be disingenuous. We do genuinely want to try to find some improvements for you, and all I can do is ask that you come on the process with us. At the end of it, you can judge us. And I guess I just remembered one of the other questions that Bridget asked. How we'll take feedback from the community on our engagement performance. If you think we're not doing a good job, you tell us. If you think we need to do something differently, you tell us. We will listen. We will try to do this in a manner that engages you the way you want to be engaged and where we get the best possible outcome, because that's what we want from this, is a good outcome. So.
We're sick of being lied to about your process and how it will affect us. Yeah. There was some questioning in the Senate. They had some questions there. ACA had two representatives there. They both came on and said, noise is not in the equation where you work out your flight paths. And I think that is still true.
I can't comment on them. I'm not sure which bit of the Senate estimates thing that was, but I'll take that on notice.
ACA spokespeople stated that.
Yep.
They said not only didn't they take it into consultation, they had no intention of doing it in the future.
Right, okay. So just one more question at the back there, and then we will have to call it quits because we're way over time.
Can you explain why you, at the beginning of this meeting, whoops, we're getting some feedback, why you scoped out a major review of the flight path design when the current design that's in place now is the product of a fundamentally flawed process. I mean, the best you've given us tonight is that we can fiddle around the edges and we can do a little bit with you, but we can't actually change too much. How about turning around and telling us what you can actually change and having a look and not putting these barriers in front of this particular process? Because fundamentally, and as the gentleman was saying earlier, this is destroying our city, you know, from a noise perspective. You know, it's unlivable.
So, yeah, as I said, we won't redesign the airspace because it's already been designed and our designers have... Yeah, no, just let me finish. So, what we have there is a design that's been designed to world standard, it's safe, it's operationally feasible. But even if we... So even if we were to redesign the airspace, those approach alignment procedures wouldn't change. The runway dictates where those approach and departure alignments go. So they won't change. Even if we threw the whole thing out and we started again, we would still have the approach procedure coming in over Hawthorn and Bulimba, and we would still have the departure going out that way when we're in that mode. Now we can look at things, as Kate said, around noise sharing and maximising over the bay, but we cannot change that because it's an international standard.
So again, you're telling us what you can't do.
Yep, I'm being honest with you. We've been told you've been lied to. I'm trying to be honest and tell you what we can't change because we can't change that. There's no point me standing here and saying, oh, yeah, we'll look at that when we can't. What we can look at is noise sharing, noise abatement procedures, looking at can we redesign parts of the flight paths to miss the more densely populated areas that maybe we didn't, you know, pay enough attention to when we did the initial design. Sorry, what was that? Yeah. As I said, as I said, the runway orientation is what determines those flight paths. So when the EIS was done and the project approval granted for the runways to operate that way, that's when those initial bits were set, and that's...
And you're also fundamentally accepting the fact that the runway needs to operate as it is.
Well, we've said we'll review, and at the terms of reference, we've updated to say that we'll review the Compass operations. So we're not saying it has to operate the way it is. We'll review, we'll provide information about how it's operating now, what that means for different communities. We'll look at are there opportunities to do that differently. But as I noted, that will require quite a bit of detailed investigation because it does have implications for the capacity of the airport, and they have an approval based on a certain capacity and being able to operate in a certain way. So, okay, so...
Some of these suburbs didn't have this problem, that people who live around the Hawthorn and Bulimba. I live further out. We didn't have aeroplanes over our suburb. You've got 2 runways now.
Mm-hmm.
How come you could cope before and put the planes over the bay? Well, you've got 2 and now you're adding more over the land. It doesn't make sense.
So they weren't all over the bay when there was runway. I live at Morningside. I've had planes flying over me for 20 years. So they're yeah, and that's because I'm not sure whereabouts you live, but you're probably aligned with the new runway, which is why you didn't have it previously.
And the noise sharing concept is, with all due respect to everyone here, I really, really feel for you, right? But you're getting the flights from the south. We get them from the north, as Don said. Ours are a lot less, right? But the noise sharing will be that you're just going to shift the problem along to someone else. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, and that's something we do have to look at. Yeah. Okay, so I appreciate there's still loads of questions and yeah, honestly, we do appreciate the level of angst that these flight paths have caused. As I said, we want to work with you on this. We'll try and answer. We've got a lot of questions online. If you've got any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask tonight, either pop them through to us on Engage or join one of the online meetings that we're having over the next couple of weeks and put them in the chat, and we'll make sure we answer them on Engage. So.
One topic is you could put multiple, it's
Yep.
and low flying, two of those is the other.
Yep.
Two problems. Low flying, no one's mentioned that very much. That's a biggie.
Yep.
But if I put in a complaint about noise to you at the moment, I could put 50 in, but it will be counted as one.
Yeah, okay, so I will address that and then we will call it quits. So our noise complaints and information service are a noise complaints registering and information providing service. They can't stop the planes flying. They can't change what the planes do. They give us the feedback on the complaints and we can look at that as part of this process, but they cannot stop them flying. So if you put in the same complaint and they've already answered the question, there's nothing else they can do in terms of providing information. The way they count it... So the reason they do that is that if you put in a complaint about a Qantas 737 and then you put in a complaint about another Qantas 737, that's counted as one complaint. If you put in a complaint about a 737 and then an over-the-bay operation, that is two different issues and it's registered differently. The reason we go on complainants is so that we get accurate data about the number of people being affected by aircraft noise, not the number of times a certain number of people complain. So we want to know the number of people that are affected. Is it the whole suburb? Is it one street? Is it one person? And so we record those complaints and report them in terms of the number of people who are complaining, not the number of times they've complained. But it still gets recorded and we're aware of that data, but we report it based on the number of complaints. It was actually an A&O recommendation that led us to that system. So we're following a recommendation of the Aircraft Noise Ombudsman on that. So on that note, I do thank you very much for your participation and for you coming along tonight. I do hope that we get to see some more of you and that we can work with you. And as I said before, I just hope that you can work through the process with us and that we can get some good outcomes for you. So thank you very much.